The title alone deserves attention. Play nice but win. That but is doing a lot of work. It suggests a tension between cooperation and competition, between ethics and aggression, between patience and dominance. The book is essentially an exploration of how Michael Dell learned to live inside that tension without collapsing into either extreme. Michael Dell starts as a teenager dismantling computers, not because he wants to rebel, but because he wants to understand. That distinction matters. This isn't the story of a visionary artist. It's the story of a systems thinker, someone who looks at inefficiency and feels compelled to fix it. From the very beginning, Dell is motivated less by creativity and more by optimization. That mindset defines everything that follows. When Dell talks about the early days of building PCs to order, what's striking isn't the boldness of the idea, but its practicality. Cut out the middleman, reduce inventory, deliver directly to customers. This isn't romantic entrepreneurship, it's disciplined execution. And that discipline becomes the core theme of the book. But here's the first question the book quietly raises. Is discipline a virtue or is it a shield? As Dell grows the company at an unprecedented rate, he repeatedly emphasizes process, structure, metrics, and control. Chaos is the enemy. Emotion is minimized. Decisions are framed as rational, inevitable, almost mechanical. And yet the stakes are deeply human. Jobs, reputations, livelihoods, identity. All of that is affected by decisions that are described in calm, almost antiseptic language. That distance is important. It tells us something about how Michael Dell sees leadership. Leadership, in his view, is not about charisma or inspiration. It's about clarity, consistency, and endurance. You don't win by being loud. You win by being right for longer than everyone else. Early success comes quickly, but the book doesn't dwell on celebration. Dell moves past it almost uncomfortably fast. What matters to him isn't that the model works. It's whether it will keep working under pressure. That obsession with sustainability over spectacle is one of the most distinctive traits in the book. And yet, success brings visibility. Visibility brings scrutiny, and scrutiny introduces a new tension. How do you remain disciplined when the world starts projecting expectations onto you? Dell goes public young, very young. And reading those sections, what stands out is not excitement, but caution. Going public is framed not as a triumph, but as a necessary tool. Capital, scale, credibility, but also exposure, loss of privacy, loss of flexibility, loss of control. That word keeps coming back, control. One of the most revealing aspects of the book is how deeply control matters to Michael Dell. Not control in a tyrannical sense, but control as coherence. He wants alignment between strategy and execution, between leadership and culture, between vision and reality. Misalignment feels intolerable to him. And that intolerance becomes more pronounced as Dell grows larger. As competitors emerge and markets shift, Dell doesn't romanticize disruption. He studies it. He watches how quickly advantages erode, how scale can become inertia, how success breeds complacency. The book repeatedly emphasizes that winning once means nothing. Winning repeatedly requires vigilance. This is where the title starts to take on real meaning. Playing nice doesn't mean being passive. It means being patient. It means not reacting emotionally. It means letting others underestimate you while you build quietly. Dell describes competitors who chase headlines, who rush into acquisitions, who prioritize short-term optics over long-term fundamentals. He doesn't attack them directly. He simply contrasts their approach with his own. The implication is clear. Noise is expensive. Silence is efficient. But this raises another question. What gets lost when efficiency becomes the highest value? As the company grows, Dell becomes more distant from the product itself. He's no longer dismantling computers. He's dismantling organizations, incentive structures, supply chains, leadership teams. And the human cost of these decisions is acknowledged, but rarely lingered on. Layoffs are described as painful but necessary. Restructuring is framed as survival. There's an almost surgical detachment in how these moments are narrated, and that detachment forces the listener to confront an uncomfortable truth about leadership at scale. You cannot optimize without cutting something away. Michael Dell doesn't shy away from this reality, but he also doesn't dwell in it. His moral framework is utilitarian. The survival of the whole justifies the pain of the part. And yet, he insists on playing nice. So what does playing nice actually mean here? It doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It means choosing when to engage. It doesn't mean sparing feelings. It means avoiding unnecessary destruction. Dell repeatedly emphasizes respect, fairness, and long-term relationships, but those values operate within a competitive framework that is unapologetic. This becomes especially clear when the book reaches its most dramatic arc. The decision to take Dell private. This is not framed as a bold gamble. It's framed as a correction, a reclaiming of autonomy. Public markets, Dell argues, reward short-term performance at the expense of long-term transformation. Innovation requires patience, and patience is punished by quarterly expectations. That insight is central to the book's philosophy. Winning, in Dell's view, is not about speed. It's about endurance, and endurance requires insulation from noise. The decision to go private is described in meticulous detail. Negotiations, opposition, lawsuits, public criticism, and through it all, Dell maintains a remarkably consistent tone. Calm, focused, resolute. But here's where the book becomes most psychologically interesting. Michael Dell positions himself as a steward, not an ego-driven founder. He insists this decision isn't about pride or control, but about responsibility. Responsibility to employees, to customers, to the future of the company. And yet, it's impossible to ignore how deeply personal this moment is. This is his name on the building, his identity intertwined with the company. Losing control wouldn't just be a strategic failure, it would be existential. And that's where the book subtly reveals its emotional core. Beneath the rational frameworks and strategic language is a man deeply invested in continuity, in coherence, in not being dismantled by forces he believes are short-sighted. The fight to take Dell private is the ultimate expression of play nice but win. He follows the rules. He negotiates. He endures criticism, but he does not back down. Winning in this context is reclaiming time to rebuild without constant interference. As this first stretch of the book makes clear, Michael Dell's story is not about explosive vision. It's about quiet persistence. It's about believing that if you stay rational long enough, you can outlast chaos. But that belief comes with costs, emotional distance, relentless pressure, a life structured around vigilance rather than ease. And as we continue, the question becomes sharper. Is this way of winning available to everyone, or only to those willing to sacrifice softness for control? As the story moves deeper into the decision to take Dell private, something subtle but important happens in the way Michael Dell talks about leadership. The language shifts from building to defending, from growth to preservation, and that shift reveals a lot about how power changes responsibility. When you're building something from nothing, risk feels energizing. It feels like movement. But when you're responsible for tens of thousands of employees and a global ecosystem, risk becomes something else entirely. It becomes moral. Every wrong move ripples outward. Dell seems acutely aware of this, and it informs almost every major decision he describes. What stands out is how much patience he displays in moments where others might escalate emotionally. Shareholder revolts, lawsuits, media narratives that portray him as self-interested or manipulative. Instead of reacting publicly, he waits, he documents, he negotiates, he absorbs. This isn't weakness, it's strategic restraint. And yet, restraint has its own psychological toll. Reading these sections, I kept thinking about how lonely this style of leadership must be. When you commit to playing the long game, you often have to let people misunderstand you in the short term. You have to tolerate being cast as the villain in someone else's story while trusting that time will eventually clarify intent. That requires an unusual relationship with ego. Michael Dell presents himself as someone who has learned to detach personal validation from public approval, but the very act of writing this book suggests that the story still matters deeply to him. He wants the record to be set straight, not emotionally, but logically. This is not a memoir of catharsis. It's a memoir of explanation. And explanation is a form of control. One of the book's recurring themes is the idea that systems outperform personalities. Dell consistently argues that companies fail not because people are bad, but because systems are misaligned. Incentives distort behavior. Metrics drive unintended consequences. Culture drifts. And leaders, if they're not careful, become prisoners of the structures they helped build. This system's first worldview is incredibly effective, but it also creates distance. People become variables. Decisions become optimizations. Trade-offs are evaluated numerically rather than emotionally. There's a moment where Dell talks about restructuring and layoffs during difficult market periods. He acknowledges the pain, but he quickly moves to rationale, survival, competitiveness, long-term viability. And while those reasons are valid, the emotional experience of those affected remains largely offstage. This isn't cruelty, it's prioritization, but it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. At scale, empathy must be rationed or leaders risk paralysis. That idea might be one of the most challenging implications of the book. Playing nice does not mean being gentle all the time. It means being fair within a framework that still produces winners and losers. Dell's fairness is procedural, not emotional. Rules apply equally. Logic governs outcomes. Personal stories don't override strategic necessity. This becomes especially clear in how he describes acquisitions, EMC, VMware, massive, complex integrations that reshape the company's identity. These are not emotional decisions, they are architectural ones. Pieces move to create a more resilient structure. What's fascinating is how little triumph he expresses in these moments. Acquisitions aren't celebrated, they're absorbed. The work begins immediately. Integration, alignment, execution. Success is defined not by announcement, but by how invisibly the system continues to function afterward. That invisibility seems to be Michael Dell's ideal state. When things work, they should disappear into the background. Attention is a cost, not a reward. And that perspective explains a lot about his leadership style. He avoids theatrics. He minimizes drama. He resists personal myth-making. Even the title of the book resists bravado. It's not dominate, crush, conquer. It's play nice but win. The win is quiet. But here's the tension that keeps surfacing. Can you build something this large, this influential, without hardening yourself in the process? Dell writes about stress, about pressure, about moments of doubt. But those moments are quickly resolved through action. There's little lingering uncertainty. Problems exist to be solved. Emotions exist to be managed. That approach is incredibly effective. It's also emotionally narrowing. One of the most revealing absences in the book is a sustained discussion of personal cost beyond stress. We hear less about relationships, about internal conflict, about identity outside the company. Dell the leader is richly drawn. Dell the person is more reserved. That's not accidental. It mirrors the way he leads. Personal life is compartmentalized. Focus is protected. Distractions are minimized. But I found myself wondering what happens when that compartmentalization becomes a habit rather than a tool. When optimization extends inward. When you begin to treat your own emotional life as something to be streamlined. The book doesn't answer that question directly, but it hints at it through repetition, the repeated emphasis on discipline, on routine, on clarity, on removing noise. These are not just business strategies, they're survival strategies. Another major idea the book returns to is timing. Dell repeatedly argues that being right too early is the same as being wrong. Ideas need the right context to succeed. Technology needs readiness. Markets need maturity. This patience is one of his greatest strengths. He resists trends that don't align with fundamentals. He waits while others rush. He invests when valuations make sense, not when hype peaks. But patience also requires confidence bordering on stubbornness. You have to believe not only that you're right, but that time will eventually prove it. That belief can be stabilizing, but it can also become isolating. When the world disagrees with you loudly enough, waiting starts to feel like defiance. Dell frames his major contrarian decisions as calm responses to data, but data never speaks entirely on its own. It's interpreted, weighted, framed, and those choices reflect values. One of the values that emerges clearly is longevity. Michael Dell is obsessed with building something that lasts, not something exciting, not something fashionable, something durable. That obsession shapes everything: product decisions, organizational design, capital structure, even communication style, durability over charisma. But durability has a cost. It resists reinvention. It favors caution. It can make adaptation slower when disruption truly requires radical change. Dell acknowledges this risk, but he consistently argues that disciplined transformation beats reckless reinvention. Change must be engineered, not improvised. This philosophy reaches its peak in the post-privatization period. Freed from quarterly pressure, Dell embarks on long-term restructuring that would have been impossible under public scrutiny. He invests heavily. He reshapes the company. He plays the long game exactly as he intended, and in doing so, he validates his core thesis. That winning isn't about speed. It's about staying power. But here's the deeper question the book invites, even if it doesn't ask it explicitly. Is staying power a universal virtue, or is it a privilege afforded by early success? Michael Dell had the resources, credibility, and leverage to wait things out. Many leaders don't. Playing nice but winning requires margin, financial margin, emotional margin, reputational margin. Without margin, patience looks like hesitation, restraint looks like weakness. So while the book offers powerful lessons, it also quietly reveals the conditions required to apply them. This is not a blueprint for everyone. It's a reflection of what becomes possible when scale, capital, and control converge. As this part of the story unfolds, one thing becomes clear. Michael Dell's greatest strength is not vision or aggression. It's endurance, the ability to remain consistent under pressure, to resist reaction, to trust systems over impulse. But endurance, when taken far enough, becomes identity. And that leads us to the final stretch of the conversation. What happens when winning becomes less about beating others and more about preserving the self you've built around winning? That question about preserving the self built around winning is where the book quietly shifts from being a business memoir to something more philosophical. Because at a certain point, the company is no longer just an organization Michael Dell leads. It's an extension of how he understands himself in the world. And that's not unique to him. It's just more visible because of the scale. As Dell moves through the post-privatization years, there's a noticeable confidence in his writing. Not arrogance, but settled conviction. He no longer feels the need to prove that his instincts are valid. He's proven them repeatedly. What he's doing now is defending the conditions that allow those instincts to operate. This is where Play Nice But Win becomes a book about insulation. Insulating long-term thinking from short-term noise. Insulating culture from panic. Insulating leadership from spectacle. And insulation, while protective, also creates distance. Dell writes extensively about culture, about values, about trust. But culture here is treated as an operating system, not a living organism. It's something to be designed, reinforced, monitored. Deviations are corrected. Misalignment is addressed. That approach works remarkably well at scale. But it also raises a question. When culture is engineered this tightly, where does dissent live? Dell emphasizes open dialogue, debate, and challenge, but always within a framework of rationality and data. Emotional dissent, intuition-based resistance, or value-driven objections that can't be quantified rarely appear in the narrative. This isn't because they don't exist. It's because they don't fit the system. And that reveals something important about Dell's leadership philosophy. He doesn't distrust people. He distrusts unpredictability. Anything that can't be modeled, measured, or stabilized is treated cautiously. That makes him a formidable operator. It also means uncertainty must always be tamed. Another recurring theme in this section of the book is the idea of fairness versus sentiment. Dell is very clear that fairness does not mean equal outcomes. It means consistent rules. This distinction shapes how he approaches everything from compensation to restructuring. There's a moral clarity to this approach, but also a moral limit. Consistent systems can still produce deeply uneven human experiences. And while Dell acknowledges this, he doesn't linger on it. That restraint is telling. Lingering invites doubt, and doubt at this level of responsibility can be dangerous. One of the most compelling moments in the book is when Dell reflects on moments where he almost lost control of the narrative. Hostile shareholders, legal challenges, media scrutiny. In each case, he returns to the same strategy. Don't react emotionally. Don't escalate publicly. Let process and time do the work. This is not passive leadership. It's delayed action. And delayed action requires extraordinary confidence in one's internal compass. But confidence has a shadow side. It can harden into certainty, and certainty can make learning slower. Dell insists he's learned constantly, adapted continuously, and the evidence supports that. The company has transformed multiple times, yet the core worldview remains remarkably stable. Discipline, control, patience, systems. The values don't evolve, they scale. That stability is both reassuring and limiting. It suggests a leader who knows himself well. It also suggests a leader who might struggle to imagine fundamentally different ways of operating. The book never seriously entertains alternative leadership philosophies. Charismatic leadership, decentralized chaos, radical experimentation. These are acknowledged mostly as contrasts, not possibilities. Michael Dell isn't curious about how others lead. He's focused on refining how he leads, and that focus has paid off enormously. But it also narrows the emotional range of the narrative. Triumph is quiet. Failure is procedural. Risk is managed. There are no wild swings, no moments of abandon. Everything is contained. Even conflict feels managed. As a listener, you begin to sense that this containment is not just professional. It's personal. Dell doesn't write about identity crises. He doesn't question his fundamental motivations. He doesn't express regret in a deep way. Mistakes are acknowledged, but framed as lessons rather than wounds. That's admirable. It's also revealing. Some people metabolize experience through emotion. Others metabolize it through structure. Michael Dell clearly belongs to the latter group, which brings us back to the idea of playing nice. Playing nice in this book does not mean being soft. It means being predictable. It means not letting ego hijack strategy. It means honoring agreements, respecting rules, and avoiding unnecessary enemies. But winning still requires confrontation, and Dell does confront. He just does it quietly, through leverage, through timing, through persistence. There's something almost martial about this approach. Win without spectacle. Defeat without humiliation. Move forward without celebration. That restraint creates stability. It also makes the victories harder to feel. Another theme that becomes more prominent here is responsibility to stakeholders beyond shareholders, employees, partners, society. Dell insists that long-term success depends on balancing these interests. But balance, again, is defined through sustainability, not sentiment. Decisions are evaluated based on whether they preserve the system, not whether they feel good. This raises a fundamental question about leadership ethics. Is moral leadership about outcomes or about experience? Dell clearly prioritizes outcomes. If the system survives and grows, the leadership was justified. Pain along the way is unfortunate, but not disqualifying. That framework makes sense at scale. But it can feel cold when viewed from the individual level. The book doesn't ask us to like this reality. It asks us to accept it, and that acceptance is part of its honesty. As the narrative approaches more recent years, there's a sense of consolidation. Dell is no longer fighting for legitimacy. He has it. What he's fighting for now is continuity, the ability to keep making long-term decisions in a world that rewards short-term reactions. That fight never ends. It just becomes quieter. And in that quiet, the book's central tension becomes clear. Playing nice is about restraint. Winning is about endurance. But endurance requires a life organized around vigilance. The book doesn't question whether that life is desirable. It simply shows us what it costs, which leads us to the final reflection. When winning becomes sustainable, when control is restored, when the system functions as intended, what remains for the person at the center of it all? That's where we'll end this conversation. By the time we reach the final stretch of play nice but win, it becomes clear that this isn't a story about triumph in the traditional sense. There's no finish line, no final victory lap. What Michael Dell describes instead is a state of ongoing responsibility. Winning, for him, is not an event. It's a condition that must be constantly maintained, and that reframes everything that came before. If you look back at the early days of Dell Computer, there was a sense of momentum. Growth felt like discovery. Decisions felt exciting because the stakes, while meaningful, were still personal. You could afford to be wrong. You could recover quickly. You could pivot. In the later chapters, that sense of discovery is replaced by vigilance. Every move must be justified. Every risk must be buffered. Every change must be survivable. This is where leadership becomes less about ambition and more about stewardship. Dell doesn't frame himself as a visionary in these years. He frames himself as a custodian, someone responsible for preserving an institution that now exists beyond any single individual, including himself. And that's an important psychological transition, because ambition feeds on possibility while stewardship feeds on obligation. One expands the self, the other constrains it. What's remarkable is how willingly Dell seems to accept that constraint. He doesn't mourn the loss of freedom. He doesn't romanticize the chaos of the early days. He sees maturity as progress. This acceptance is perhaps the most underappreciated lesson of the book. Many leaders struggle not with growth, but with the emotional shift that growth requires. They want the rewards of scale without the discipline it demands. Dell embraces the discipline fully, but embracing discipline doesn't mean it doesn't cost anything. There's a subtle sense, especially in the closing sections, that Dell's life is organized almost entirely around continuity. Not just of the company, but of the worldview that sustains it. He's careful about who he listens to. He's selective about where he intervenes. He protects his time, his focus, his decision-making bandwidth. This is not the life of a reactive person. It's the life of someone constantly filtering the world. And filtering is exhausting, even when you're good at it. The book doesn't dwell on fatigue, but it's there between the lines, in the emphasis on routines, in the insistence on preparation, in the avoidance of unnecessary conflict. These are the habits of someone who understands how fragile clarity can be under pressure. Another idea that surfaces near the end is legacy. Dell is cautious with the word. He doesn't define it grandly. Legacy, for him, seems to mean durability without dependence. A company that can outlast its founder without losing its identity. That's a paradox. Founders shape identity deeply. Removing themselves without destabilizing the system requires immense restraint. Dell appears to be actively working toward that. Delegating, institutionalizing values, reducing reliance on his personal intervention. This is leadership as subtraction rather than addition. And subtraction is harder than creation, because it requires letting go of control gradually, deliberately, without allowing decay. It requires trusting the system you built to function without your constant presence. For someone who has spent decades optimizing systems, that trust is not emotional, it's logical. But logic doesn't always quiet the instinct to intervene. The book suggests that Dell is learning to sit with that tension, not resolve it, just manage it, which brings us to the emotional core of Play Nice But Win. It's not about winning markets. It's about winning time, buying enough stability to make thoughtful decisions, creating enough buffer to avoid reactive leadership. In that sense, playing nice is not about kindness. It's about reducing friction. Friction wastes energy. Energy is finite, and leaders at this level must spend it carefully. This reframing helps explain the title in a deeper way. Playing nice is strategic courtesy. It's choosing cooperation over conflict when possible. It's avoiding unnecessary battles so you have strength for the unavoidable ones. Winning, then, is not about domination. It's about survival with integrity intact. Michael Dell's integrity, as portrayed in the book, is consistency. He does what he says he'll do. He honors agreements. He avoids impulsive reversals. That consistency builds trust. And trust at scale is a form of capital. But consistency can also become rigidity if left unexamined. The book doesn't resolve that tension. It leaves us with an open question. At what point does discipline stop being a strength and start becoming a limitation? Dell seems aware of this risk. He emphasizes feedback, data, diverse perspectives. But all of these still operate within the same fundamental framework. There is no radical reinvention of self here, no late-stage awakening, no dramatic transformation, and that might be the most honest ending possible. Not every story needs a cathartic conclusion. Some stories are about maintenance, about holding complexity together without collapse. In that way, Play Nice But Win feels less like a celebration and more like a manual for endurance. It tells us that winning is rarely glorious. It's procedural, it's disciplined, it's often thankless, and it requires a willingness to be misunderstood in the short term for the sake of long-term outcomes. For anyone listening to this who aspires to leadership, the book offers a sobering message. Success doesn't simplify life, it complicates it, and the higher you go, the fewer emotional shortcuts you're allowed. You must become steadier, not louder, clearer, not more expressive. Patient even when patience feels unnatural. Michael Dell didn't win by being the most charismatic or the most aggressive. He won by being the most consistent. And consistency, sustained over decades, is a kind of quiet courage. That's the lasting takeaway of this book. Not that you should imitate Michael Dell, but that you should understand the trade offs of the kind of winning you pursue, because every version of winning demands a different kind of self. And the question the book leaves us with is not whether playing nice works. It's whether the version of you that emerges from playing nice but winning is the one you're prepared to live with.